When we discuss the global drug trade, our minds drift to Latin America. We think of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo, and brazen wars fought on the streets. We see gold-plated pistols and viral videos of sicarios. This is the version of organized crime the world knows best, loud, chaotic, and perpetually at war with the state. It is a model built on terror, but while the world's attention was fixed on the noise coming from Mexico and Colombia, a far more sophisticated, wealthy, and dangerous empire was rising in the East. This organization did not seek fame. It did not post threats on social media or hang banners from bridges. Instead, it operated with the quiet efficiency of a Fortune 500-style company. This is the story of the Sam Gor Syndicate, an entity so elusive that for years global law enforcement did not even know it existed as a unified group. They simply called it the company. We need to understand the sheer scale of what this silence achieved. While Western cartels fought bloody turf wars that disrupted their own supply chains, Sam Gor built a seamless logistical machine that spanned the entire Asia-Pacific region. Analysts and intelligence agencies estimate that at its peak, this single syndicate was generating between $8 billion and $21 billion annually. Those billions rival the top-tier legitimate corporations on the global stage. It dwarfs the estimated revenues of the most famous Latin American cartels. At the center of this silent empire sat a man who looked nothing like a drug lord. Tse Chi Lop did not wear flashy jewelry or carry weapons. He dressed like a middle-aged accountant or a tech executive on vacation. Yet this man, often referred to as the Bill Gates of the Underworld, achieved the impossible. He did not just run a gang, he united Asia's fiercest criminal rivals into a corporate alliance. The core question we must answer is how one man, operating from the shadows, managed to replace the chaos of gang warfare with the cold, hard efficiency of a multinational corporation. To understand the corporate structure of the Sam Gor Syndicate, we must first analyze the environment that forged its architect. Tse Chi Lop was born in Guangzhou, China in the 1960s. His formative years were defined not by wealth or criminal glamour, but by the absolute chaos of the Cultural Revolution. This was a period where the social fabric of China was torn apart, where traditional authority collapsed and survival depended on one's ability to navigate shifting alliances and brutal purges. It was in this crucible of anarchy that the foundation of his criminal philosophy was laid. During these years, a specific group emerged from the turmoil known as the Big Circle Boys. Unlike traditional triads that were steeped in centuries of ritual and blood oaths, the Big Circle Boys were formed largely by former Red Guards, paramilitary youths who had been the shock troops of Mao's revolution. When the political winds shifted and these young militants were cast aside, they did not reintegrate into society. Instead, they turned their military training, tactical discipline, and hardened resolve toward crime. Tse Chi Lop cut his teeth within this grim fraternity. The Big Circle Boys were known for their strategic planning and military precision, traits that Tse would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the late 1980s, Tse migrated to Toronto, Canada. There, he treated the city not as a hiding place, but as a classroom. He established a crucial relationship with the Rizzuto crime family in Montreal. The Rizzutos operated as a consortium, bringing together warring factions, Italians, bikers, and street gangs under a single umbrella. This observation was pivotal. Tse saw that the Rizzutos generated wealth through diplomacy rather than dominance. He learned that conflict is expensive and attracts law enforcement, while cooperation maximizes profit. Tse applied this immediately, helping the Big Circle Boys source heroin for the Rizzuto network, bridging the gap between Asian supply and North American demand while mastering global logistics. However, his rise was interrupted in 1998 when the FBI arrested him on drug trafficking charges. He was extradited to the United States and faced a potential life sentence. In a courtroom in New York, Tse played the part of the repentant family man perfectly, pleading for leniency and promising to open a legitimate restaurant if released. The court, perhaps underestimating the man before them, sentenced him to only 9 years. Tse served his time in a federal correctional institution in Elkton, Ohio. but he did not use those years to reform. Instead, he treated prison like a corporate retreat or an MBA program for the underworld. He spent his sentence networking with other incarcerated high-level traffickers, studying the failures of other organizations, and refining his theory of the drug trade. He realized that the ego-driven violence of the past was the greatest weakness of any criminal enterprise. When he was released in 2006, he returned to Asia not as a broken man, but as a visionary with a blueprint. He was ready to build an organization that prioritized supply chain efficiency over territorial control, and he knew exactly which rival groups he needed to bring to the table to make it happen. Upon his return to the streets of Hong Kong, Tse Chi Lop did not look at the criminal landscape and see enemies. He saw inefficiency. For decades, the Asian underworld had been defined by bloody tribal warfare. The major triad groups, ancient secret societies steeped in ritual and blood oaths, had spent the better part of a century hacking at each other over street corners in Kowloon and gambling dens in Macau. It was a zero-sum game where every dollar gained by one group was a dollar lost by another. Tse realized that fighting for a slice of the pie was small-time thinking. He intended to own the bakery. To achieve this, he orchestrated a diplomatic feat that makes legitimate corporate mergers look simple. He brought together the leaders of 5 distinct, often hostile, criminal organizations to form a super syndicate. They named the entity the Company, Sam Gor, a nod to Tse's nickname. The alliance was historic, uniting Hong Kong's powerful 14K, Wo Shing Wo and Sun Yi On Triads with Taiwan's Bamboo Union and Tse's own Big Circle Boys. These groups were historically bitter rivals who had spent decades at war. Uniting them was the geopolitical equivalent of the world's 5 largest tech giants agreeing to stop suing each other to build a single shared monopoly. Tse Chi Lop's pitch to these warlords was strictly business. He proposed a corporate structure that replaced the traditional feudal hierarchy with a modern consortium model. In a typical cartel, a single dictator hoards the wealth and the soldiers fight for scraps. The company was different. It operated on a profit-sharing basis where each group brought their specific competitive advantage to the table. The 14K and Sun Yi On controlled the wharves and the warehousing in Hong Kong. The Bamboo Union provided access to world-class chemists and political cover in Taiwan. The Big Circle Boys brought their paramilitary discipline and mastery of logistics. By pooling these resources, they created a supply chain that no single group could have built alone. This structure democratized the drug trade, effectively turning international trafficking into a franchise system. It allowed smaller, independent criminal groups to buy into the infrastructure without having to build it themselves. If a local gang in Sydney or a mid-level distributor in Tokyo wanted to move product, they did not need to fight a war for a shipping route or bribe their own customs officials. They simply paid the company for the service. They could invest in a specific shipment, pay for insurance, and receive their product with a guarantee. It was in essence logistics as a service. It functioned like a platform economy. Just as Amazon provides the warehousing and shipping for thousands of small businesses, Sam Gor provided the international transit for thousands of local dealers. Logistics became the core offering. The most profound impact of this merger was the cultural shift it enforced. Under Tse's guidance, the syndicate implemented a peace pact that prioritized revenue over reputation. The street-level violence that attracts police attention, the drive-by shootings and public executions, was deemed bad for business. Disputes between the 5 groups were no longer settled with knives in a back alley, but through arbitration and financial settlements. They realized that a dead rival pays no debts, but a living partner generates revenue. This pivot from territorial aggression to supply chain efficiency is what allowed them to scale without the friction that destroys Western cartels. While the Mexicans were busy fighting the army, Sam Gor was busy buying cargo ships, corrupting port authorities, and focusing entirely on the metrics of production and profit margin. With the boardroom united in Hong Kong and the corporate structure solidified, the syndicate needed a factory floor capable of matching their global ambitions. They turned their gaze to one of the most lawless and geographically complex regions on Earth, the Golden Triangle. This rugged expanse of jungle and mountains where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar converge had been the epicenter of the global heroin trade for half a century. But Tse Chi Lop and his partners were not interested in the romanticized old-world drug trade of poppy fields and mule trains. They were interested in industrial efficiency, and that meant orchestrating a historic pivot from agriculture to chemistry. For decades, the Golden Triangle's primary export was heroin. While profitable, heroin is an agricultural commodity vulnerable to droughts, floods, and satellite surveillance. Tse realized that to build a scalable empire, they had to eliminate their dependence on nature. They shifted the region's primary output to synthetic methamphetamine. This transition represented the industrial revolution of the Asian underworld. They no longer needed arable land, they needed privacy and chemicals. They established operations in the semi-autonomous Shan state of Myanmar, a fractured territory governed by ethnic warlords. In exchange for massive tax payments, these militias provided sovereign protection. Under the watch of armed soldiers, the Syndicate constructed super labs. These were not makeshift kitchens, but state-of-the-art industrial facilities equipped with high-grade cooling systems and commercial generators capable of running 24 hours a day. A factory is useless without raw materials. The Syndicate sourced tons of precursor chemicals, specifically ephedrine, from the industrial zones of southern China. They leveraged the massive flow of chemicals within China's pharmaceutical sectors, diverting tons of product through shell companies and corrupt officials. These chemicals created a pipeline that fed the super labs. To ensure market dominance, the Syndicate refused to rely on amateur cooks. They imported world-class chemists from Taiwan, utilizing highly skilled technicians who treated the production process with scientific rigor to maximize yield and purity. The result was a product of terrifying quality. The crystal meth pouring out of these jungle laboratories consistently tested at purity levels above 99%. It was a premium product manufactured at a discount cost. By industrializing the process, the Syndicate achieved economies of scale that were previously unimaginable. They produced so much methamphetamine that they could afford to lose tons of it to police seizures and still make billions. In fact, the production volume was so high that it caused the wholesale price of meth to crash across the Asia-Pacific region. But this was part of the plan. Lower prices hooked more users, expanded the market, and drove competitors out of business, leaving Sam Gor as the undisputed monopoly of the Golden Triangle. Having secured an industrial supply of product that was both higher in quality and lower in cost than anything else on the market, Tse Chi Lop faced the final and perhaps most dangerous hurdle of the drug trade: distribution. In the traditional underworld, moving narcotics across international borders is a gamble. Every shipment is a roll of the dice against customs officers, coast guards, and rival hijackers. If a shipment is intercepted by the police, the buyer usually takes the loss. They lose their money, they lose the product, and often they lose their lives to debt collectors. This risk creates friction. It makes buyers hesitant to place large orders. Tse looked at this dynamic and saw a market inefficiency. He realized that to truly dominate the Asia-Pacific, he did not need better smugglers, he needed better customer service. This led to the single greatest innovation in the history of organized crime: guaranteed delivery. The Syndicate promised wholesale customers that if a shipment was seized by police or lost at sea, the company would replace it immediately at no extra cost or refund the deposit. It was a radical departure from the buyer beware mentality, functioning like Amazon Prime for the black market. This policy broke the competitive landscape. Smaller groups could not afford to eat the cost of a lost ton of methamphetamine, but Sam Gor could. Because they controlled the Golden Triangle factories, the manufacturing cost was negligible compared to street value. A seized shipment was not a financial disaster, it was a marketing expense to build customer loyalty. Why would a distributor risk buying from an unreliable gang when Tse Chi Lop offered 100% financial security? With the customers secured, the Syndicate engineered a distribution network of terrifying scope, often referred to by intelligence agencies as the Pacific Drug Highway. This was not a single route, but a complex, multimodal logistics web that utilized the vastness of the ocean to hide in plain sight. They employed a fleet of motherships, large, ocean-going trawlers that would sit in international waters, far beyond the reach of national coast guards. These floating warehouses would hold massive stockpiles of product, waiting for smaller, faster fishing vessels to come out and ferry partial loads to the coastlines of Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. To move this product through customs and across borders on land, the Syndicate used a signature concealment method that became their brand identity, the tea packet. They packaged their high-purity methamphetamine in gold and green, vacuum-sealed bags, branded as premium Guanyin Wang Chinese tea. Guanyin became a seal of quality. The packets were innocuous. In Asia, tea is traded in such massive volumes that a few thousand packets in a shipping container or the back of a truck attract little attention. For those in the know, that specific tea branding signified that the crystal inside was Sam Gor product, pure, potent, and guaranteed. Innocuous packaging hit a corporate supply chain. The destination for these tea packets was chosen with the same calculated precision as the manufacturing hubs. While they supplied markets across the globe, their primary targets were the high-income nations of the Asia-Pacific, including South Korea, Japan, and especially Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand commanded the highest street prices. This was a masterclass in economic arbitrage. Tse understood that the price of a commodity is determined by its location. In the jungles of Myanmar, a kilogram of methamphetamine might cost the Syndicate a few $1,000s to produce. But that same kilogram, once it crossed the ocean and landed on the streets of Sydney or Auckland, could be sold for up to $200,000. Australia and New Zealand have some of the highest street prices for narcotics in the world, driven by geographic isolation and strict border controls. By conquering the logistics of the Pacific Drug Highway, the Syndicate was able to exploit this margin. They were buying at third world production costs and selling at first world luxury prices. The profit margins were not measured in percentages, they were measured in multiples of thousands. A single successful shipment to Melbourne could generate more profit than a year of trafficking into Europe. This arbitrage fueled the explosive growth of their war chest, transforming a regional alliance into an entity with more liquidity than the banking systems of the small nations they operated in. They had turned the tyranny of distance into their greatest asset, and with the guaranteed delivery policy ensuring the flow never stopped, the money began to pile up faster than they could count it. Generating $20 billion in revenue presents a problem that is, in many ways, more difficult than manufacturing drugs. The key obstacle was weight. When you are dealing with street-level narcotics sales, you are drowning in small denomination bills. $1 million in $20 bills weighs roughly 50 pounds. $1 billion weighs 25 tons. You cannot simply put 25 tons of cash into a suitcase, and you certainly cannot walk into a legitimate bank and deposit it. For a traditional criminal organization, this physical mountain of cash is a liability. It is heavy, it smells, and it is the primary evidence that lands people in prison. But for the Sam Gor Syndicate, this was merely another logistical challenge to be solved with corporate ingenuity. They did not just need a way to hide money, they needed a global financial infrastructure capable of cleaning it on an industrial scale. To solve this, Tse Chi Lop and his executive circle turned to the glitter and noise of the world's largest gambling hub. They looked to Macau. While Las Vegas is famous in terms of sheer revenue, it is a dwarf compared to Macau. This former Portuguese colony is the only place in China where casinos are legal, and it served as the primary engine for the Syndicate's laundering operations. But the Syndicate was not interested in the bright lights of the main gaming floors where tourists played slot machines. Their business was conducted in the exclusive velvet-roped VIP rooms, and their partners were the junket operators. The junket system is unique to Macau. These are independent companies that act as middlemen, bringing ultra-wealthy gamblers from mainland China to the casinos. They lend them money, arrange their travel, and handle their debts. For the Syndicate, the junkets were the perfect cover. They provided a mechanism to move massive amounts of value across borders without a single dollar bill physically crossing a checkpoint. They utilized a technique known in the Underworld as the mirror transaction, and in Chinese banking circles as flying money. The mechanics are elegant. A syndicate distributor in Sydney hands 10 million Australian dollars in cash to a local associate of a Macau junket operator. The associate secures the cash in Sydney. At that exact moment, the junket operator in a VIP room in Macau credits a gambling account with the equivalent value. The money has effectively flown across the ocean without a single wire transfer. The syndicate leader in Macau sits at a baccarat table, plays a few hands to create the appearance of legitimate activity, and then cashes out. He exchanges his chips for a check or digital transfer from the casino. Suddenly, dirty drug money has been transformed into verifiable gambling winnings issued by a regulated entity. It is now clean, taxable, and ready for the global economy. Macau was just the first wash cycle. To make the money truly untraceable, the syndicate utilized Hong Kong and Singapore, feeding funds into a labyrinth of shell companies using trade-based money laundering. A company might over-invoice for goods, buying textiles for $1 million, but invoicing for $5 million, allowing the extra $4 million to move through the banking system under the guise of commerce. This architecture was supported by a diversified portfolio. The syndicate purchased luxury real estate in Vancouver, London, and Bangkok through anonymous trusts and utilized cryptocurrency to move funds instantly. They essentially built a shadow banking system that mirrored the legitimate economy. The complexity of this laundering machine made it nearly impossible for authorities to follow the trail. By the time a police force in Australia identified a suspicious cash drop, that value had already flown to Macau, being converted into casino chips, transferred to a Hong Kong bank used to buy real estate in Canada, and then leveraged to purchase chemicals in China. The money moved at the speed of fiber optic cables, while the law enforcement investigations moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Tse Chi Lop had built a system where the profits were not just hidden, they were woven into the very fabric of the global financial system, making the syndicate not just a criminal group, but a major economic player in the Asia-Pacific region. To the casual observer, Tse Chi Lop was a ghost. If you passed him on the street in Hong Kong or sat next to him in a cafe in Taipei, you would see a balding, middle-aged man in khakis and a polo shirt. He had the unassuming air of a weary provincial accountant or a retired factory manager. He did not carry the swagger of a man who held the fate of the Asian narcotics trade in his hands. But this carefully cultivated image of mediocrity evaporated the moment he stepped onto a tarmac or into a casino. Behind the facade of the everyman lay a lifestyle of such obscene extravagance that it rivaled the excesses of the world's most famous oligarchs and tech moguls. When Tse traveled, he did not fly commercial. He moved across the Asia-Pacific on a fleet of private jets, treating international borders like minor inconveniences. And he never moved alone. While he eschewed the showy, gun-toting sicarios favored by Latin American cartels, his security detail was no less formidable. He was constantly surrounded by a phalanx of 8 professional Thai kickboxers, a rotating guard of elite martial artists hired to ensure that no rival and no law enforcement agent could get within striking distance. These bodyguards were a symbol of his status, a quiet, muscular wall that separated the billionaire from the world he was exploiting. His spending habits were legendary within the underworld, used not just for pleasure, but as a display of absolute power. He threw lavish parties at 5-star resorts and private islands, flying in guests and entertainers from around the world. But it was at the gambling tables where the true scale of his wealth became terrifyingly clear. In the VIP rooms of Macau, where the stakes are already the highest on earth, Tse was a whale among minnows. There is a story corroborated by intelligence reports that during a single night of baccarat at a Macau casino, Tse Chi Lop lost $66 million. Most people would be ruined by such a loss. For Tse, it was merely a bad Tuesday. He reportedly took the loss with a shrug, a chilling demonstration that $66 million was a rounding error in the ledger of the Sam Gor Syndicate. But spending that kind of money leaves a footprint, no matter how carefully you try to cover your tracks. By 2019, the silence Tse had cultivated was beginning to break. The Australian Federal Police, who had been tracking the flood of tea packet meth hitting their shores, realised that the disparate gangs they were arresting were all tentacles of the same beast. They initiated Operation Kunga, a massive international task force that would become one of the largest coordinated law enforcement efforts in history. It was not just Australia, it involved the DEA, the RCMP, the Chinese Ministry of Public Security, and agencies from Thailand, Myanmar, Japan, and New Zealand. Over 20 agencies from across the globe set aside their geopolitical differences to hunt one man. The net began to tighten. Intelligence agencies tracked him across Asia, listening to wiretaps and monitoring the movement of his private jets. They watched as he moved between his safe havens in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. For a long time, Taiwan served as a sanctuary. Because Taiwan has no extradition treaty with Australia or China, Tse felt relatively secure living in Taipei. He continued to run his empire from the shadows of the Taiwanese capital, seemingly untouchable. However, the pressure from Operation Kungur was relentless. The authorities began squeezing his network, arresting key lieutenants and seizing assets, creating an atmosphere of paranoia. In early 2021, sensing the walls closing in or perhaps feeling the heat from local Taiwanese authorities who were tired of hosting him, Tse made a critical error. He decided to move. On January the 22nd, 2021, Tse Chi Lop boarded a flight from Taipei bound for Toronto, Canada. It was a calculated risk. As a Canadian citizen, he likely believed that once he was back on Canadian soil, the legal complexities of extradition would offer him a layer of protection that he no longer felt in Asia. But to get to Canada, his flight plan required a layover. He landed at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, one of the busiest transit hubs in Europe. He likely expected to walk through the terminal, grab a coffee, and board his connecting flight without incident. He was wrong. The Australian Federal Police had been waiting for this exact moment. They had issued an Interpol red notice and the Dutch authorities were ready. As Tse walked through the airport, police officers moved in. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase through the terminal, and no last stand. The Asian El Chapo was detained without a struggle, handcuffed in a sterile European airport while surrounded by tourists and business travelers. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to the reign of a man who had reshaped the global drug trade. He was eventually extradited to Australia to face justice, charged with conspiracy to traffic commercial quantities of controlled drugs, a legal battle that would be fought with the highest paid lawyers money could buy. The arrest was hailed as a monumental victory for global law enforcement. Press conferences were held, champagne was likely corked, and the world's media ran headlines declaring the kingpin had fallen. But in the months that followed, a disturbing reality began to set in. The authorities watched the markets closely, expecting the price of methamphetamine to spike or the supply to dwindle as the syndicate collapsed. They waited for the chaos. But it never came. The price of crystal meth on the streets of Sydney, Tokyo, and Auckland remained stable. The tea packets continued to wash up on shores. The super labs in the Golden Triangle did not shut down. The smoke from their generators continued to rise into the jungle canopy. The arrest of Tse Chi Lop proved Tse Chi Lop's ultimate theory correct. If you build a true corporation, the CEO is replaceable. The Sam Gor Syndicate was not a cult of personality, it was a decentralized system. Tse had built an infrastructure so robust, with independent cells managing logistics, manufacturing, and finance, that the removal of the head did not kill the body. The company simply promoted the next executive in line. The profit-sharing model ensured that the remaining triad leaders had every incentive to keep the peace and keep the product moving. The supply chains were automated, the bribes were prepaid, and the routes were established. Tse Chi Lop sat in a prison cell, but the machine he built continued to hum with terrifying efficiency, proving that in the modern age of industrial crime, the business model is far more powerful than the man who created it. The arrest of Tse Chi Lop was not just the closing of a chapter, it was a stark warning for the future. He proved that the evolution of organized crime is not about gold pistols or street corners, but about logistics, efficiency, and borderless ambition. The Sam Gor Syndicate demonstrated that a shadow corporation can amass wealth that rivals sovereign nations, operating entirely outside the reach of traditional law enforcement. While the architect sits in a cell, the blueprint he perfected survives. The super labs in the Golden Triangle still hum, and the tea packets still cross the ocean, driven by a demand that no single arrest can extinguish. We are witnessing a new era of global power, where criminal empires operate with the sophistication and scale of tech giants. This is the reality of the Asian century's underworld. If you want to continue exploring the hidden engines of global power and heritage, make sure to subscribe.